Thank you guys for tuning in today, and welcome to another episode of The Source, where we interview policy experts, whistleblowers, or farmer insiders. My name is Zain Raza, and today we'll be talking about the US election, in particular the Sanders campaign, Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange, and the coronavirus, with Dr. Jill Stein, who is an activist, physician, and the former presidential candidate of the Green Party. Jill Stein, great to have you on again.
Really great to be with you, Zain.
Let us begin with the election. There was a lot of momentum going in the beginning that Sanders is going to win, but after Super Tuesday 1 and 2, it seems that Biden is the front runner. Before we get into the underlying reasons, could you talk about the results for our European viewers?
Yes, so it's been kind of a wipeout for the Sanders campaign and the hopes and dreams and aspirations of an entire generation, really. Starting with a primary in South Carolina, Biden had a victory which was anticipated, and it was his first. Not only the first in this campaign, but the first in the three presidential campaigns that he's run over many decades. He has never won. This is not a person with the qualities that you'd want to see in a president, so it's no surprise he wasn't winning. But he had a very solid in South Carolina. It was a tiny turnout, a 20% turnout election in a state which is not typical for the U.S. at large, but it was used as a springboard for a massive onslaught of a public relations campaign and for the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, and the Democratic Party insiders to really exert the full power of manufactured consent. And we saw it happening in real time. It was used then for 3 days of basically free media, of so-called earned media by the corporate media establishment, nonstop, 24/7, how great Biden is, that his win is inevitable, that he's the only one who can stand up to Donald Trump, and the continuation of a smear campaign against Bernie Sanders, which has been ongoing really for the last 8 years, approximately, ever since the first hints of his presidential campaign in 2016, which was, a couple of years before. So he won most of Super Tuesday and then most of the Little Super Tuesday that followed. So he has a substantial lead now, which will be almost impossible for Bernie Sanders to make up on. So this has been a political earthquake, but to observers like myself, this is not a surprise. It was shocking that Sanders got as far as he did, and he was leading the pack in contributions, in volunteers, in organization, and in the polls. It really looked like he had a shot, and his supporters, who tend to be younger and less, shall we say, experienced in the ways of empire, it is an incredible shock to them. They are reeling right now, and our whole, I think the political framework is very much in flux, and it is an opportunity to redefine our political system in a way that is not so much under the stranglehold of oligarchy and empire.
The majority of the media is citing demographic reasons, that the black voter turnout was bigger for the black community's voter turnout was bigger for Bernie Sanders, and also Sanders' electability issues are being cited by the corporate media in Germany here. What is really being cited is the Democratic establishment, systemic reasons, and also what is also being missed out is what I notice is the health issues of Biden. Could you talk about these two things?
Yes, and these issues, interestingly, the health issues in particular, were raised early on by many, even in the mainstream media. Morning Joe, for example, who's become, an ardent defender of Joe Biden, was one of the first actually to say, hey, what's going on here? This guy is not altogether there. Are we sure? Basically he said, why are we being quiet about this? Why is the media silent? We really need to take stock of what's going on here. And, what is evident in his media appearances, in his debates, with rare exceptions. You know, when someone has cognitive issues, or is going into cognitive decline, or they're not well for some reason, they typically fluctuate. So it's not like they're dysfunctional all the time, but when you see really erratic performances and bizarre behavior, Biden said things like, in his various addresses, he introduced his wife as his sister and his sister as his wife. He said, "Hi, I'm Joe Biden. I'm running for U.S. Senate." He called Vermont New Hampshire, or New Hampshire, Vermont. He's not in possession of his full faculties. It's very clear. And, when he frequently gets lost in the middle of his statements. Sorry, my dog is stealing my lunch here. And he has real trouble with higher order policy statements. He attacks the press. He often argues with and threatens voters that he meets on the campaign trail. And one of these videos actually went viral on Super Tuesday. No, I think it was the mini Super Tuesday, this most recent one, where he was touring a recently started auto factory in Detroit, and got into a very bitter argument with one of the factory workers about Second Amendment rights. And he threatened the guy, had his finger in his face, said we should step outside and settle this, implying, let's go out and fight. And others were trying to intervene, and he very rudely, shut them out. He's just behaving in a way that suggests this is not someone who should have their finger on the button of a doomsday nuclear arsenal. That's not to say, that Donald Trump should either, but our choice should not be between an extremely dangerous racist demagogue who currently has his finger on all the buttons, and someone who's really struggling with cognitive issues. And you're right, the media, most of the mainstream media, they're not only refusing to discuss this, they're providing 24/7 cover and providing, preposterous defenses, like that his argument with this factory worker about the Second Amendment showed how brave he is. But this guy will be torn to shreds by Donald Trump. His campaign motto is, Trump's motto is "Make America Great Again." Biden's motto is "Back to normal." Let's get back to normal. But actually, it should be called "Let's get back to the conditions that brought us Donald Trump," because his agenda, his program, and the people that he has in mind, his potential candidates for his cabinet, are neoliberalism on steroids and the war machine on steroids. So everything that has led to, the onslaught against workers' economic security and jobs and wages and healthcare and housing and student debt, all of that is, we're going to see that on steroids under a Biden administration. But he's not even going to get close, because Donald Trump is not going to be forgiving, and he will show up and debate if Joe Biden doesn't. So, Biden is going to be damned if he does and damned if he doesn't, if he is allowed to be the candidate. So it's very important that we struggle against this to the extent that we can, but it's very much looking like we are destined for another 4 years of Donald Trump, which again underscores why we need really long-term and urgent political change in order to harness the rebellion, which is actually going full swing and is very strong. And, we're seeing it all over the world in the uprising of working people against corruption and neoliberalism and, the dismantling of our democratic institutions. Ordinary people are fighting back everywhere. And that's happening here, especially youth who are looking at the climate crisis full in the face. there's a powerful movement and it needs political expression. The Sanders campaign asked the question, will the Democratic Party be a vehicle for this transformative change? And that question has been rather definitively answered now, that the Democratic Party will do everything in its power, use all the tools at its disposal in order to prevent that transition within the Democratic Party.
So how far is Bernie Sanders responsible for, let's say, up to this point, the failure? Because he knew this was coming, and people like you have warned him before, and have also offered him to join the Green Party. We saw 2016 as evidence of how the DNC puts all its resources in stopping him, and we have seen since then how political capital has been squandered in Russiagate, Trump's impeachment, and now in stopping Bernie Sanders. So, and also he does not, in my opinion, address the issue of ranked choice voting far enough, which you advocate. So how far should we hold Bernie Sanders accountable instead of always looking for reasons around him?
I think the bottom line is that Bernie Sanders is very hobbled by the system that he embraces. And technically he is a democratic socialist and not a member of the Democratic Party, but in reality, he's been in Washington, D.C. for decades, and he is very integrated with the Democratic Party and works with them, and that really is his framework, which is why the Green Party is not a part of the Democratic Party. So I don't fault him. I mean, that's who he is. He's a very imperfect, but what should we say, inspired and valiant politician who's done he's really accomplished miracles considering what can be actually done inside the Democratic Party. I think he's been unrealistic in failing to recognize that the party was going to take him down. I mean, there's no way. It has done this since 1942, I believe it was, when Henry Wallace, a really inspired socialist, almost received the vice presidential nomination to run with FDR in his last term, where it was known that there was going to be a transition during that term. So getting the VP nomination amounted to being nominated for president. And the fire alarm was pulled, and a fire emergency was declared just before his nominator was coming to the microphone. That was in 1944. The convention was adjourned, and when it reconvened the next morning, we got Harry Truman instead of a Democratic socialist and peace advocate, and from there on, it was the Cold War, it was Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and, the military-industrial complex on steroids. That was a fateful moment. It wasn't altogether a departure from where the Democratic Party was for some decades before, but it was really kind of a step up and a step into our post-war history. And that has been repeated in one form or another, whether with Jesse Jackson or Dennis Kucinich, with Bernie Sanders in 2016. They will allow these inspired and progressive figures to be seen and to sort of sheepdog lots of people back into the party, and then they will cut them off. They will ambush them. And this has happened repeatedly. And any real observer of political history has to know that, which gets to the critical importance of ranked choice voting. And thank you for bringing that up. I think independent politics, that is independent of the corporate establishment, is absolutely critical. We need independent politics, and whether that's Democratic Socialists, independent of the Democratic Party, because here they're mostly not. That may be an exciting transition that's coming up. We may see a lot of breaking away. People are already talking about Dem exit. Ranked choice voting ends the ability of a corporate boss, like the Democratic Party bosses, to basically assault, sideline, and demolish truly progressive and leftist campaigns from within the party. So that's one thing. It's got to be independent. But then you need ranked choice voting, because in our two-party system, you're basically smeared as a spoiler, although often, for the most part, those votes don't belong to the political establishment, and those votes mostly come from people who wouldn't otherwise be voting. That's been my experience of this. Greens who would vote for there were a lot of Greens who were going to vote for and who were actually working for Sanders. He was a well-deserved candidate. But that's not going to happen with Biden. So these aren't stolen votes, but the public perceives that, and they're very terrified of Donald Trump and, George Bush and, whoever the Republican is. Many of the progressives are terrified. So ranked choice voting liberates us from the hysteria of spoilers or split votes, and it allows us to actually use our values to drive our political system forward, to express our votes, and to build coalitions across parties. Because right now it's a divide and conquer thing. They try to split progressives up, those who are fighting inside the Democratic Party from those who've thrown in the towel and are working outside. So it is a win-win, and it is going gangbusters right now, which is the really exciting thing. It's working in the state of Maine. People love it. We have a Senate candidate there by the name of Lisa Savage, who is running for U.S. Senate she's running as an independent, Green endorsed, but with a Green Party agenda. And she's actually, she can't be silenced as a spoiler. So it's really exciting to watch that race as kind of a bellwether of what we could be doing. And just to quickly mention, New York City just passed it overwhelmingly by something like 75% of the vote. And it's now up for a referendum here in my home state in Massachusetts.
So for the young people, could you just really quickly talk about how ranked choice voting works?
Yes, so in the US, we use so-called first past the post. And that means basically you get a vote, you get one vote for single office things. So we're not talking parliament, we're not talking Congress or the legislature. This is like for president or for mayor or for governor, where there's one winner. You can only vote for one person under our current system, and whoever has the most votes wins under this system, even if it's a tiny minority and there's a huge majority, a progressive majority, but if they are split by a couple of progressive candidates, the current system lends itself to very arbitrary outcomes that don't reflect the will of the voters and do not reflect a majority consensus behind someone. Under ranked choice voting, you rank your choices. So you can say, I want a Ralph Nader first, and Al Gore would be my safety as a second choice. And maybe, the libertarian is my third choice or something like that. You rank your choices. And if your first choice loses, your vote is automatically reassigned to your second choice. That's kind of the simple way to explain it. You never have to worry about throwing away your vote or splitting the vote or spoiling an election. It unleashes the power of our values to drive our political system. Right now, our values are locked out, and people are, always trying to game the system with their votes rather than expressing our vision forward.
Before I move to the next topic, many consider Biden to be a war criminal due to his endorsement of the Iraq War. Should Bernie Sanders endorsed Biden as he did with Hillary Clinton in 2016. What is your opinion?
In my opinion, Biden is going to lose this election under the best of circumstances. So there really is not, in my view, some kind of practical argument that Sanders should again defy his higher values and compromise with a very toxic and failing system. I think the sooner we break with that system, Sanders could lead the Dem exit into a joint progressive movement in this election, potentially. And, in my view, that's what we ought to be thinking about, is how do we begin to salvage not just this election, but the future of our democracy and everything that depends on it. Because in spite of, this so-called strong progressive movement and the little indicators of, it's making progress, they had a great fundraising, system this time. You can find little indicators of progress. But if you look at the ultimate impacts on our air, our water, our wars, the climate, neoliberalism and the desperate straits of our economy, we are not making progress. We are continuing to march to the right under this two-party system. We have to bypass that system. We need to create a new system that actually reflects the power of the political rebellion that is already going on right now. It's in full swing, and we need to harness that and build it in a way that doesn't get destroyed every 4 years when the illusion of a progressive, viable candidate is destroyed. They have to start all over again. We need to put our feet down. We need to create a movement and a framework within which we can truly do outreach, voter education, build from the ground up, and take our democracy and our future back.
I want to talk about the coronavirus in relation to the US healthcare system. In Western countries such as US, Germany, and Italy, we're seeing a lot of strain on the healthcare system and massive shortages in supplies, personnel, equipment. I saw a report recently in the US that people are being hit by huge bills in thousands of dollars after being released from the hospital these bills are coming from the insurance companies. Could you talk about the US healthcare system and how it is dealing with the coronavirus?
Well, the coronavirus really reveals, it sort of unveils, it takes the mask off of a failed healthcare system. It's not only the expense of it, it's that it doesn't cover people. It's like some 87 million people. It's about 45% of American adults who either don't have health insurance or who have to pay costs that are absolutely prohibitive. So it's not working. And when you have holes in healthcare coverage, like in our system, there's no way that you can treat a pandemic and an epidemic within the country. So we are not monitoring. We don't have adequate tests. We're not protecting our healthcare providers. We're not protecting workers, who are keeping our food system running. We're at a point right now, I know in Europe and now here too, we're getting a taste of it, that the basic pillars of our society are really trembling, and people are understandably very worried and starting to talk about, planting victory gardens because, as things begin to shut down, it's just not clear that our system is going to be functioning, not only in order to stop the spread of the virus, but also to just keep society alive and well and functioning. So, it really brings out what's broken. It's easy to fix. This should be a cause for an emergency Medicare for all transition. And that should be begun right now. And there should be an emergency transition to it. But it's clear we're in a different moment right now. And what the virus tells us, what the pandemic tells us, is that we are on one small boat. And the healthcare injustice anywhere is a threat to public health everywhere. In other words, the most marginalized, off the beaten pathway community, all of us depend on their having adequate health care as well, which interfaces with economic justice, because, poverty is one of the biggest causes also of death and disease and suffering and so on. So, it makes the point that, to use Martin Luther King's actual quote, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And, the virus really brings that home. We can fix these healthcare problems. It's not only that we need Medicare for all, we also need to have sick leave for workers. We need guarantees when people become unemployed, et cetera. We are one very closely knit organism right now, and we're all extremely interdependent on each other. And that should be, the silver lining here. If we can learn that, we're going to be a different society going forward.
We can also see this with regardless of friends or foes. We are seeing right now with Iran, they're suffering tremendously, and yet the media or the political establishment is not even talking about lifting US sanctions. Why do you think the US is not lifting sanctions? Because if we don't stop the coronavirus in Iran, it's just going to affect everybody around the world.
Well, it reflects really the essential rot in American democracy, because we're not only neglecting what we have to do in terms of foreign policy, that we really have to stop economic sanctions, which are actually illegal and which are deadly. And, it's a form of warfare, covert warfare, and sort of unusual warfare. But it's wrong and it should be stopped. We're not only not doing that, we're not even taking care of our own population, and, we have an entire generation that's locked in debt. I mean, we are reaching sort of the moment of consequences. Our corporate-driven system has been on a trajectory of massive failure for a very, very long time. It goes back to kind of the founding of the U.S. as really a corporate state initially. So we really have to change the traditions and the thinking. And it's not simply, a matter of doing the right thing. It's a matter of doing what we have to do if we are going to get out of here alive.
I want to close the interview with Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning. So far, outside Tulsi Gabbard, none of the leading candidates have even mentioned his name or her name, Chelsea Manning, even though massive mobilization is taking place globally. acTVism Munich was in London last month covering the demonstration that took place for Assange and press freedoms. And we also saw no corporate media there televising the whole event. So talk about why there's a failure by the media, including the political establishment, progressives such as Bernie Sanders, to cover this issue. And also tell us what people should be doing to keep support and coverage on Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning.
Yes. Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning are being punished for blowing the whistle on war crimes, on corruption, and illegalities on the part of the U.S. government and many other governments around the world as well. But the U.S. is the big gorilla among them, and they are both being persecuted. And it's absolutely outrageous that Chelsea Manning is now doing double jeopardy. Having served her term and been pardoned, she's now back there because she refuses to sort of incriminate Julian Assange, which is what they're trying to do. Maybe that reflects that their case is weak and they know it's weak and they're trying to drag some additional evidence out of her. But this is outrageous. But just to set that aside for a moment and to focus on Assange, he's not being prosecuted, he's being persecuted. He is a victim of torture. He is being punished for blowing the whistle. He has been the victim of a smear campaign for approximately 10 years now. And the United Nations Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Melzer, has articulated this beautifully, that Assange is not being prosecuted, he's been persecuted by a gang of so-called democratic states that have essentially ganged up on him and which have created a legal entrapment in order to send him over to the U.S. and lock him up for life. And what Melzer points out is that the legal case thrown against him really makes a mockery of our legal system. And in the UK as well. It's absolutely outrageous how a variety of nation states essentially conspired against him. And in Melzer's words, this legal case is based on very few facts, little to no facts. It violates rule of law and legal protocol. So it's an abomination of the legal system. And the press, in my view, the press does not deserve that title. They shouldn't be called the press. They should be called the oppress, or the repress, because they've become total lapdogs to power. And anyone who is not, screaming at the top of their lungs, any member of the press who fails to recognize that it's their future, it's their right to press freedom, which is on trial right now, is asleep at the wheel, and they are derelict of duty not to be standing up and calling out this crime. In the U.S., this has a lot to do with the political myths that have been created around Assange, that he's been a so-called tool of Russia and part of the Russiagate plot and all that, and and conspired in a way that was very humiliating to Hillary Clinton. So many of the Democrats are very focused on the humiliation of Hillary Clinton as opposed to the cheating and the betrayal of the U.S. citizens that was revealed by those leaks. So those leaks, or whatever they were, the leak or the hack, and the proof is not there that there was a hack that Russia was involved in, and that WikiLeaks was inclusion. That has not been proven, but the American public has sort of accepted that, or at least the the Democratic the diehard Democrats are continuing to embrace that. Russiagate and Ukrainegate and Trump's impeachment, which has where has that gotten us? It's only improved Trump's popularity. So, that's part of a very desperate strategy by the Democratic Party to maintain its grip on power. It's not working. They are making mincemeat of our democratic traditions and our freedom of the press, which is essential and basically doesn't exist now because that freedom has already been compromised by the corporate buyout of our our institutions of the press. So, we badly, as citizens, we need to stand up and cry foul. And it's encouraging that something that was totally silenced now is at least being discussed. It appears that, the arguments of Assange's legal team are getting some traction, just in that their desperation of the prosecution that's keeping Chelsea Clinton locked up. It's hard to know what's going on, but I think it's really important for every one of us to defend our democracy. And whatever institution is closest to you, whether it's the U.S. government, write your congressperson or your senator. If you're in the UK, weigh in with the foreign secretary or other high-ranking elected officials. Australia also should have a hand in this, and Australia's foreign minister should be demanding the release of their citizen. They have not stood up for Julian Assange in the least, even though he's very popular. From what I understand, he has enormous support, and people want to bring him home. Purely on a medical basis and medical ethics, he should be released. He is very sick for all kinds of reasons that I won't go into, but Doctors for Assange has articulated this beautifully, and if people are interested, that's doctorsassange.org, and it's a group of international physicians who've basically said, and I'm a medical doctor, and I gotta say, it rang all my alarm bells when I heard about what was happening to him last spring, and he was becoming disoriented after basically being deprived of sunlight and exercise and potentially nutrition for an outrageous long time. The man could be extremely immune suppressed, and there are all kinds of crazy things that could be going on with him, but his public behavior has been extremely alarming. He's had a life-threatening weight loss. The man needs to be released, and he's been really illegally kept in confinement for bogus reasons that do not hold up under a real court of law. So this is outrageous. This is a case of torture, and the governments. We should all be calling out our governments on this and demanding that he be released, that Chelsea Manning be released, and that this basic institution of our democracy, our free press, needs to be defended by all of us.
Dr. Jill Stein, activist, physician, and former presidential candidate, thank you so much for your time.
Great talking with you as always, Zane. Thank you.
And thank you guys for tuning in today. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button below, and to donate so we can continue to produce independent and non-profit news and analysis outside of corporate media. I'm your host, Zain Raza. See you guys next time.